So we just finished up our organelles war, and in fourth place was the plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane actually had a pretty good argument, and we're actually going to spend a little bit of time talking about what makes the plasma membrane so important to the cell. So here's a diagram of what a phospholipid bilayer looks like, or a plasma membrane. And one of the first scientists to describe the plasma membrane was S.J. Singer in 1972. And he described it as a fluid mosaic model. And what that means is that when you look at the cell membrane from above, the proteins that are found embedded or sitting on top of the plasma membrane actually move. And those phospholipids that make it up move in almost a wave structure. So he realized that the cell membrane or the plasma membrane wasn't as rigid as previously thought. Now, the plasma membrane has a couple of important features, and the first is that it is selectively permeable, which means it can regulate what enters and exits the cell. You can have small non-polar substances move freely within the plasma membrane, so example would be nitrogen. But if large polar molecules, polar meaning it has a charge and it's hydrophilic, or ions need to move through, they actually have to use the proteins that are found embedded within the plasma membrane. So while we're talking about proteins embedded in the plasma membrane, I want to point out some of the different structures. So when you look at this diagram, you should see a lot going on. You have those proteins that I was talking about, which help move those large polar molecules in and out of the cell. You might also notice that these words glycolipid, glycoprotein, and you see these carbohydrate chains. All of these are involved in cell communication and cell recognition. So an example of the importance of these is that this is the way our white blood cells have actually targeted cancer cells. In addition, you'll notice these bright yellow structures in this diagram embedded within the phospholipids, and these are cholesterol molecules. And if you remember cholesterol molecules that we've talked about in organic compounds, they have a pretty interesting structure. And it's because of their structure and their chemical makeup that allows the plasma membrane to actually have that fluidity, meaning they're the little molecules that are responsible for the cell membrane not being very rigid. Here's a simplified diagram of what a phospholipid looks like. It's going to have a phosphate head and two fatty acid tails. And so we've already talked about lipids, and we've discussed how lipids are composed of fatty acids. Well, a polymer of lipids is a phospholipid, and that plays an important role in the plasma membrane. It has two main parts. It has a hydrophilic head. Hydrophilic means water-loving, so this is the part of the molecule that interacts with the water part or the aqueous part of the environment. And then these fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, and that word hydrophobic means water-fearing. So these are the parts of the cell that are water-fearing. Non-polar, polar. So polar parts of the molecule are hydrophilic, non-polar are hydrophobic. And then this is what they look like when they actually are together making up the plasma membrane. You have the polar region sticking out, and then the fatty acid or the hydrophobic tails sticking inwards towards each other. There are a couple types of proteins that are found within the plasma membrane, and the first type is an integral protein. These are the proteins that span the entire plasma membrane, and they're going to have a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic end, meaning they're going to interact with the aqueous environment and the non-aqueous, meaning within those fatty acid tails. And these are going to be really important when we talk about cell transport. The second type of protein is what's called a peripheral protein, and these are proteins that stick just around the outside of the plasma membrane. So they're not hydrophobic and hydrophilic. They're actually polar, which makes them just hydrophilic. And like I said, we're going to talk about these proteins a little bit more in depth in the next video. The last thing that's important to mention are the function of these proteins in the plasma membrane. They allow for transport. They are used as enzymatic activity, so we find certain enzymes that allow certain communication to occur between cells. Speaking of which, they are involved in signal transduction, cell-to-cell recognition, and cell-to-cell attachments. All three of those fall under cell communication, and that's the last part of this unit that we're going to talk about. And they also provide a means to attach to the cytoskeleton in the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix is the area right above the plasma membrane that's composed of a bunch of carbohydrate chains and some complex molecules.